If you've ever watched a wildfire on the news, you've seen the Canadair water bomber, that massive yellow amphibian, impossibly low over a lake, scooping 6,000 liters of water in 12 seconds before climbing toward the flames. Behind that aircraft was a Montreal factory that held 100% of the global market in purpose-built firefighting amphibians. The program survived the Avro Aero cancellation, survived a $1.4 billion scandal that nearly destroyed the company, survived nationalization, privatization, Bombardier, and 3 changes of ownership. And then, in 2015, the production line shut down. 33 workers laid off. The aircraft that had survived everything was finished. How does something that proved unkillable for half a century simply stop? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Foresters and the Flying Boat. The story begins with fire, specifically with the boreal fires that tear through Quebec's northern forests every summer. Fires that move faster than a man can run, that jump rivers, that turn the sky over towns 100 kilometers south, the color of a bruise. In the early 1960s, the men responsible for fighting those fires had a problem. The aircraft they were flying, converted consolidated PBY Cansos, wartime flying boats built for hunting submarines in the North Atlantic, were 20 years old, slow, corroded by the freshwater lakes they scooped from, and never designed to carry water in the first place. Quebec's service. Aérien, the provincial forestry air service, needed something better, and they knew exactly where to ask. The Cartierville plant sat in Saint-Laurent, on the northwest edge of Montreal, alongside a municipal airport that had hosted the city's first airmail flight in 1918. The factory itself was older than the country's aviation industry. It had started life as a Canadian Vickers facility. Vickers Sons and Maxim, the British shipbuilding giant, had established a Canadian subsidiary in 1911, and by the Second World War, the Cartierville Works was turning out PBY Catalinas for the Royal Canadian Air Force, at a rate that made it one of the most productive aircraft plants in the country. At peak wartime production, 8,000 to 10,000 workers passed through those gates. But Vickers had other priorities by 1944. Shipbuilding consumed the parent company's attention, and Ottawa, under wartime industrial pressures that left no room for distracted management, took the plant over. On the 11th of November, 1944, the federal government created Canadair Limited, installing as its first president a former Vickers executive named Benjamin W. Franklin. Franklin, no relation to the famous American, inherited a workforce, a runway, and a factory floor that hummed with the residual energy of wartime production. What he didn't inherit was a product line. The Canso orders were winding down. Canadair needed to become something more than a wartime assembly shop, or it would become nothing at all. What followed was a quarter-century of reinvention. The Electric Boat Company acquired a controlling interest in 1946. When Electric Boat merged with Consolidated Vultee in 1952 to form General Dynamics, Canadair became a subsidiary of one of the largest defense contractors in the world. The Cartierville floor built F-86 Sabres under license, then T-33 Silver Stars, then CF-104 Starfighters, then the CT-114 Tudor, the little jet trainer that would later become the aircraft of the Snowbirds aerobatic team. It was competent work, skilled work, the kind of precision manufacturing that kept 9,200 people employed at the plant's 1968 peak. But it was license work, building other people's designs under contract. The engineering talent at Cartierville was deep, but it had never been unleashed on a clean-sheet aircraft of its own. The Quebec Foresters changed that. When the Service Aérien approached Canadair in the early 60s, asking for a purpose-built water bomber, not another adaptation, not another bolted-on tank system, but an aircraft conceived from the first pencil stroke to scoop water from a lake and drop it on fire. The Cartierville Engineering Department finally had a problem worth solving, and it arrived at exactly the moment when the right man walked through the door to solve it. Chapter 2. The aero engineer and the flat-bottomed hull W. Ross Richardson arrived at Canadair carrying the particular grief of a cancelled masterpiece. He'd been an engineer at Avro Canada in Toronto. Avro, the company that had designed and built the CF-105 Aero, the most advanced interceptor in the world, the aircraft that was supposed to prove Canada could build anything. On the 20th of February, 1959, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker cancelled the Aero program and ordered all 6 prototypes destroyed. 14,000 Avro employees lost their jobs in a single day. It remains the most traumatic moment in Canadian aerospace history, a wound that has never fully healed, a national what if that still provokes arguments in any room where engineers gather. Richardson went south to Montreal. So did dozens of his Avro colleagues, drawn to the only other major aircraft operation in the country. At Canadair, under General Dynamics ownership, Richardson joined an engineering department that was technically accomplished but creatively restrained, a licensed production shop that built other companies' aircraft to other companies' specifications. The water bomber project was different. This was a clean sheet. This was a Canadian design for a Canadian problem, and Ross Richardson threw himself into it with the energy of a man who had been told once that his country's best work wasn't worth finishing. The preliminary design was designated CL-204. What Richardson and his team had to solve was deceptively simple to state and ferociously difficult to execute. Build an amphibious aircraft that could fly to a lake, descend to skim the surface at 70 knots, fill its tanks with more than 5,000 liters of water in 12 seconds through ventral probes forced open by ram pressure, climb back out with 6 tons of additional weight sloshing in its belly, fly to a fire, drop that water with precision, and then turn around and do it again. And again. And again. 6, 7, 8 times an hour, in turbulence generated by the fire itself, in visibility reduced to meters by smoke, at altitudes low enough to clip treetops. The engineering problems stacked. The hull had to absorb hydrodynamic shock at scooping speed, repeated impacts equivalent to a hard landing, dozens of times per mission, thousands of times per airframe life. Richardson's solution was a flat-bottomed planing hull with a fail-safe structure and modern corrosion treatment, an approach that made the CL-215, in the words of Flight International in 1965, the first aircraft to be designed to perform water bombing missions as a primary role. The high-wing configuration gave the engines ground clearance on water and the rudder enough authority for the violent maneuvering required over flames. The 4 ventral probes could fill the tanks, 5,346 liters, over a 410-meter water run. 12 seconds from dry to loaded. The numbers sound clinical on paper. In practice, they describe something closer to controlled violence. A 20-ton aircraft hitting a lake at highway speed, swallowing 6 tons of water through its belly and hauling itself back into smoke-filled air before the far shore arrived. Richardson co-holds the patent on the airborne retardant mixing system with 2 colleagues, Saul Bernstein and Harry Oakes. A system that allowed chemical retardant to be injected into the water during the scooping run, so the aircraft dropped not just water, but fire-suppressing foam without ever stopping to reload on land. It was an elegant solution to a logistical problem that had plagued every previous water bombing operation. The time wasted returning to an airstrip to refill from a ground tanker. The CL-215 didn't need an airstrip. It needed a lake. And in Canada, in Quebec especially, lakes were the one thing no one would ever run out of. The executive who championed the project through General Dynamics' corporate hierarchy was Frederick R. Kearns, a man whose biography reads like a compressed history of mid-century Canadian aviation. Kearns had been a Spitfire pilot, one of the thousands of young Canadians who flew for the RAF and RCAF during the Second World War and came home with a permanent attachment to aircraft and a conviction that Canada should build its own. By the mid-1960s, Kearns was Canadair's president, pushing General Dynamics in Fort Worth for project approval against the inertia of a parent company that preferred license work to clean sheet risk. The CL-204 design evolved into the definitive CL-215 under his watch, and it was Kearns who took the aircraft to the 1965 Paris Air Show, unveiling it to the international market for the first time. Program go-ahead came in February 1966. The prototype, registered CF-FEUX, flew for the first time at Cartierville on the 23rd of October, 1967. The registration was a joke of sorts. FEU is the French word for fire. Somebody in the office had a sense of humor about what they were building. The aircraft lifted off the runway that afternoon into an autumn sky over Montreal, and Ross Richardson, the aero engineer who had watched his last aircraft get cut into scrap, watched a new one climb. Chapter 3. A lake, a runway, and a world on fire. The first delivery went to France. In June 1969, one of 10 aircraft ordered by the Protection Civile, later renamed Sécurité Civile, was handed over at Cartierville and flown across the Atlantic. The same month, the first aircraft arrived with the government of Quebec, replacing the Service Aérien's exhausted Cansos. The symmetry was deliberate. The French had anchored the order book with a 10-aircraft contract worth £4 million, and Quebec had followed with 15. Between them, the two francophone governments had made the CL-215 viable before a single aircraft had proved itself in fire. What happened next was a slow-building commercial success driven by something no sales team could have manufactured. The aircraft worked. Not adequately. Not with caveats. It worked in conditions that destroyed other approaches. Converted Cansos, the Martin Mars flying boats, Grumman trackers, land-based tankers rigged with belly tanks, all of them carried water, and all of them had been built for something else. The CL-215 was the only aircraft on Earth designed from scratch with a planing hull, integrated tanks, retractable scooping probes, and a structure engineered to absorb the punishment of repeated water pickups in turbulent conditions. Flight International called it one of the very few entirely new large marine aircraft to be put in hand for some 20 years. That wasn't marketing language. It was a statement of fact. Nobody else was building these. By November 1968, Canadair had committed to a first production batch of 30 aircraft. Spain's Servicio Aéreo de Trabajos Forestales, the future 43 Grupo, which would operate the type continuously for half a century, signed on. Greece's Hellenic Air Force ordered 16, delivered between 1973 and 1990. Italy followed, then Yugoslavia, then, in 1978, Thailand, the Royal Thai Navy, taking delivery for search and rescue and coastal patrol, extending the type's reach beyond firefighting for the first time. The Cartierville workforce that built these aircraft was bilingual, unionized, and, by the standards of Canadian aerospace, deeply experienced. The plant's union, IM Local 712, formed on the 5th of March 1940 to consolidate aircraft workers across Canadian Vickers, Fairchild in Longueuil, and Nordeuil in Cartierville, was one of the oldest aerospace locals in the country. The shop floor was overwhelmingly francophone. The engineering offices and senior management were mostly anglophone. That linguistic divide tracked the class divide almost perfectly. French hands building what English voices designed. It was the structural reality of Quebec industrial life before the Quiet Revolution transformed the province's relationship with its own economy. And it gave the Cartierville plant a particular tension, familiar to anyone who worked in Montreal manufacturing in that era, where the language you spoke determined not just your job title, but your ceiling. Canadair's employment had plunged from 9,200 at its 1968 peak to under 2,000 by 1975, gutted by post-Vietnam defense cuts and a global aerospace recession so severe that General Dynamics, the Fort Worth parent, prepared to abandon its Canadian subsidiary altogether. In 1976, Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government reacquired Canadair from General Dynamics, making it a federal crown corporation. The purchase was simultaneously regional development for Quebec, industrial sovereignty for the country, and a bet that the Cartierville plant still had something to offer beyond license assembly. The CL-215, now selling steadily to European fire services, was the strongest card in the hand Ottawa had just bought. Production ran for 21 years. 125 CL-215s rolled off the Cartierville line between 1969 and the final delivery in May 1990. 11 countries. Every continent with forests to burn. By 1980, the Canadair water bomber program held effectively 100% of the global market share in purpose-built amphibious firefighting aircraft, a monopoly built not on patent protection or government subsidy, but on the blunt fact that no one else had designed anything that could do what the CL-215 did. The yellow paint scheme, a high-visibility safety convention originally derived from Forestry Service livery, became so universally associated with the type that in France, Spain, Italy, and Greece, the word Canadair stopped being a company name and became a generic noun. Any amphibious firefighting aircraft, regardless of who built it, was a Canadair. It was the kind of brand penetration that marketing executives spend careers chasing. Canadair achieved it by building an aircraft that saved lives and painting it yellow. Chapter 4. 12 Seconds on the Lake. Imagine the final approach. The pilot, French Sécurité Civile, let's say, flying from Nîmes-Garons Air Base in Provence, has already made this run 4 times today. The lake below is maybe a kilometer long, maybe less. The smoke from the fire is drifting across the approach path. The air temperature at altitude was comfortable. At 200 feet, it's a wall of heat rising off burning pine forest. The turbulence kicks the aircraft sideways, and the pilot corrects with a rudder input that would be aggressive in any other context, but is routine here. Routine the way a logger's chainsaw work is routine, which is to say, practiced to the point of reflex, but never actually safe. The CL-215 descends to skim the lake. At 70 knots, barely above stall speed for an aircraft this size, the pilot deploys the 4 ventral probes. They drop into the water. The aircraft is now a boat and a plane simultaneously, its flat-bottomed hull riding the surface while the wings keep it from settling. Water rams into the tanks under its own pressure. No pumps, no mechanical assistance, just the forward speed of the aircraft forcing 6,137 liters through the probes in 12 seconds. 410 meters of lake surface consumed in a water run that lasts about as long as it takes to read this sentence aloud twice. The probes retract. The pilot advances the throttles. The aircraft, now 6 tons heavier than it was 12 seconds ago, hauls itself back into air that smells of smoke and pine resin, and the particular metallic tang of superheated rock. French Sécurité Civile crews describe the experience in testimony recorded by their own service. Flying in the 3rd dimension, battling heat, turbulence, and visibility loss only meters above the treetops. The understatement is characteristically French military. What they're describing is flying a 20-ton amphibian at treetop height through thermals strong enough to flip a light aircraft, in visibility that drops to 0 without warning, scooping water from lakes sometimes shorter than ideal, and then climbing back into smoke to make the drop. A single CL-415, the turboprop successor, averages 6.9 water drops per flight hour according to Bombardier's published figures. That's nearly 7 complete cycles of approach, scoop, climb, transit, drop, return. Every hour. In conditions that ground most other aircraft. The pilots who flew these missions became, in their respective countries, the equivalent of combat aviators. Elite, self-selected, operating at the edge of what the aircraft and the human body could sustain. Among the names the camera could follow, Commandant Daniel Manzo and co-pilot Xavier Ansaldi of the French Sécurité Civile's Pelican 32, filmed by their own service over Swedish forests during a 2018 EU mutual aid deployment. France's entire CL-415 fleet, 12 aircraft, all based at Nîmes-Garons, branded Pelicans with individual numbers, has operated in continuous Noria rotation during every major Mediterranean fire season since the type entered French service in 1969. The 2022 Gironde fire campaign deployed 6 Pelicans, numbers 32, 34, 35, 42, 45, and 48, alongside 3-8 Q400 MR tankers, in a continuous aerial relay that ran from dawn to nightfall for days. The cost of this work has been real. Of 125 CL-215s built, the Greek Hellenic Air Force alone lost 10 of its 20 aircraft, with 5 fatal accidents claiming 12 airmen. Of 95 CL-415s built, 14 have been destroyed in operational accidents. The names accumulate like a war memorial. FZBFQ, Pelican 43, lost at La Ciotat in November 1997. FZBez, Pelican 41, St. Croix Lake, March 2004. FZBO, Pelican 36, Corsica, August 2005. two Italian aircraft on the same day, the 23rd of July, 2007, at Roccaperturo and Styra. The most recent high-profile loss, on the 25th of July, 2023, Hellenic Air Force CL-215, number 1055, clipped a tree during a drop near Charistos on Evia Island. Both pilots, Commander Christos Moulis, 34, and Second Lieutenant Pericles Stefanidis, 27, were killed. Greece was enduring its third successive heat wave that summer. 28 people died in wildfires across the country that year. Moulis and Stefanidis were two of them. Nobody who flies water bombers talks about the work casually. The margins are too thin. The aircraft is too close to the ground, too close to the fire, too heavy after the scoop, too slow on the climb out. Every scooping run is a calculated gamble that the lake is long enough, the turbulence manageable, the visibility sufficient, the trees on the far shore far enough away. Multiply that gamble by 7 runs an hour, by 10 hours a day, by a fire season that in southern Europe now stretches from May to October, and the mathematics of risk become very simple. Somebody, eventually, doesn't come back. Chapter 5. The Cartierville Floor and the World Beyond. Back at Plant 1 in Saint Laurent, the factory that produced these aircraft carried its own particular atmosphere, one shaped as much by the Montreal climate as by the machines inside. The building was the original Canadian Vickers structure, brick and steel, built to wartime industrial standards, which meant strong and functional and entirely indifferent to the comfort of anyone working inside it. In January, when the temperature outside dropped to -20, and the wind came off the river carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin, the heating inside struggled to keep pace with the cold that crept through every gap in the walls. Workers arriving for the morning shift walked from frozen parking lots into a building where the temperature near the doors might not be much better than outside, and didn't warm appreciably until you moved deeper into the assembly area where the overhead lights and the body heat of 100 workers and the friction of riveting guns created something approaching comfort. By summer, the same building reversed. The brick absorbed the July heat. The ventilation was never designed for a Montreal humid continental summer. And the assembly floor became a greenhouse where the smell of aviation sealant and hydraulic fluid thickened in the still air until the afternoon break. The aircraft took shape in stages. The hull sections, that flat-bottomed, fail-safe structure that Ross Richardson's team had designed to absorb thousands of water impacts, were assembled first. The aluminium skin riveted to the frames by workers whose skill with a pneumatic rivet gun was measured not in degrees or certificates, but in the absence of rejected work. The wings came next, high-mounted to keep the engines clear of spray during water operations. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines, the same engine type that had powered the F-6F Hellcat and P-47 Thunderbolt in the Second World War, were mounted on the wings with a mechanic's respect for piston engines that had been proving themselves reliable since 1939. The CL-215 was not a technologically radical aircraft. Its genius was in the integration, in taking proven components and assembling them into a purpose-built system that worked in conditions no other aircraft could survive. The workforce at Cartierville in the CL-215 years was a compression of Montreal's industrial demographics. Francophone sheet metal workers and riveters alongside Anglophone engineers and inspectors. Italian immigrants from the Petite Italie neighborhood north of the factory, who had come to Montreal in the post-war wave and found in aerospace work a step up from the construction and garment trades that had first absorbed them. Portuguese workers from the community centered on Saint Laurent Boulevard. Greek workers, an irony not lost on anyone, building aircraft that would later be flown by the Hellenic Air Force over the fires of Attica and the Peloponnese. The factory floor at Cartierville was a map of Montreal's immigration history, compressed into a single building and united by a common competence: the ability to build an aircraft that could take a beating. The yellow CL-215 became something more than an aircraft in the countries that operated it. In France, the Pelicans of Nimes-Garons were arguably more famous than any military aircraft except the Mirage. Children in Provence grew up watching the yellow planes pass overhead on their way to fires, low and heavy and impossibly loud. And the sound of their engines became the sound of summer itself. The sound that meant the garrigue was burning, and someone was doing something about it. Spain's 43 Grupo, operating from Torrejon since the 1970s, built an identity around the type that transcended its military designation. When the Spanish APES organization honored the CL-215-415 with the Batafuegos de Oro in 2006, the citation called it the most efficient tool for the aerial combat of forest fires, key to the organization of firefighting in a large number of countries. In Greece, where the 355 MTM Atlas Squadron at Elefsis Air Base had operated CL-215s since 1973, the type acquired a status closer to national infrastructure than military hardware. An aircraft the country depended upon the way it depended on the Coast Guard or the Army, fundamental and non-negotiable. And then there was the relationship with California. Beginning in 1994, the government of Quebec started sending 2 CL-415s to Los Angeles County every summer, under an agreement between Quebec and the county fire department, a 31-year-old arrangement that made Quebec, of all places, a critical supplier of aerial firefighting capacity to the most fire-prone urban wildland interface in North America. The aircraft went by their call signs, Quebec 1 and Quebec 2, and the nickname that Los Angeles County crews gave the type stuck, Super Scooper. It was a California coinage, born of the shock that a Canadian provincial government-owned aircraft capable of doing what no American-operated tanker could match. The name traveled back across the continent and across the Atlantic, attaching itself to the CL-415 as a universal sobriquet. A water bomber conceived for Quebec foresters by federal engineers in Montreal, built by a bilingual workforce in Saint Laurent, and nicknamed by California firefighters. Few industrial products have ever accumulated a more improbable biography. Chapter 6. The Summit. Before the Storm. By 1980, Canadair was at the summit of its institutional confidence. The CL-215 order book was full. The CL-89 and CL-289 reconnaissance drone programs, surveillance systems sold to NATO allies, were contributing revenue and technological credibility. And the Challenger 600, a wide-body business jet designed in-house by Harry Halton's engineering team, was rolling towards certification and international fanfare. Fred Kearns, still president, stood at the center of all of it. The former Spitfire pilot, who had pushed General Dynamics for the water bomber's approval, had grown into something larger, a Crown Corporation CEO with the confidence of a man who believed he was building a world-class aerospace company, not just maintaining a government-subsidized assembly shop. The Challenger was his boldest move. In late 1975, an agent had brought Kearns the concept for a wide-body business jet called the Learstar 600, designed by the American inventor Bill Lear. Kearns acquired exclusive rights in April 1976 and turned his chief engineer, Harry Halton, loose on the redesign. Halton was a remarkable figure. A brilliant aeronautical engineer, he had been paralyzed from the waist down since 1975, following surgery for a spinal tumor. He managed the entire Challenger program from a wheelchair, attended design reviews, supervised prototype assembly, pushed the engineering team through the kind of 17-hour days that produce either a masterpiece or a catastrophe. Halton's team reworked Lear's original concept so thoroughly that Lear himself, displeased with the changes, particularly the widening of the fuselage from 88 inches to 106, dubbed the result Fat Albert, and walked away from the project. The Challenger 600 that emerged from Cartierville was, for all practical purposes, a Canadair aircraft wearing a borrowed name. It was certified in August 1980 and immediately began attracting orders from corporate buyers worldwide. For a moment, perhaps 2 years, perhaps 3, everything at the Cartierville plant seemed to be working simultaneously. The water bombers rolling off one part of the floor, the Challengers rolling off another, the drone programs ticking along. 9,200 workers reduced to under 2,000 in the mid-70s, rebuilt to roughly 5,500 by 1983 around the Challenger ramp-up. The parking lot was full again. The union halls were busy. The plant hummed the way it had hummed during the Sabre years, with the particular energy of a facility that has too much work rather than too little. But the numbers behind the Challenger were already wrong. Kearns had priced the aircraft aggressively to win market share, committing to delivery schedules the plant couldn't meet, and cost projections the program couldn't hold. The federal government, now the sole owner, was funding the gap, and the mechanism by which it funded that gap would become, within 2 years, the most politically explosive financial scandal in Canadian aerospace history. The water bomber line didn't know any of this, or if the workers on that part of the floor sensed something. An unusual number of suits in the hallways, meetings behind closed doors, the particular tension that enters a building when the executives stop making small talk in the elevator. They had no reason to think it involved their program. The CL-215 was selling. The CL-215 was profitable. The CL-215 was the one thing at Canadair that nobody argued about. The Auditor General's investigators arrived that summer. They were looking at the Challenger, and every yellow aircraft that had already left the building, scooping water in Provence, flying over the Greek islands, working the Quebec boreal, was about to become the only part of Canadair that anyone could point to and say, that part worked, that part we got right. The reckoning was coming. It would be measured in billions. Chapter 7. Letters of Comfort. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Industry Minister Jean Chrétien, who held in succession the Treasury Board, Industry, Trade and Commerce, and Finance portfolios under Pierre Trudeau, had used a device called Letters of Comfort to fund the Challenger program's ballooning costs. The letters were non-statutory ministerial assurances to Canadair's commercial lenders that the federal government would stand behind the company's borrowings. They were not loan guarantees in the legal sense. They were not tabled in Parliament. They were not subject to the scrutiny that statutory commitments required. They were, in effect, a minister's signature on a piece of paper that told the banks, "Lend the money. Ottawa will make you whole." And the banks, seeing the Government of Canada's implicit backing, lent freely. The problem was not that the money was spent. Crown corporations spend government money. That is the nature of the arrangement. The problem was that the scale of the commitment was hidden. Auditor General Kenneth Dye, in his 1982 report to the House of Commons, Chapter 10, paragraphs 1095 through 10100, flagged the letters of comfort as instruments that had kept from Parliament and the public for several years the true scale of the federal financial exposure to Canadair's Challenger program. The language was measured, as Auditor General language always is. The implication was not. A minister of the Crown had used informal assurances to bypass the normal mechanisms of parliamentary oversight, committing hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer liability without the knowledge of the House of Commons. The device would later become a standard academic example in Canadian public administration courses of insufficient monitoring and lax controls in government support of industry. Inside the Cartierville plant, the Challenger program was consuming everything. The aircraft had been priced to capture market share. Kearns had set a unit price that assumed production efficiencies the plant hadn't yet achieved, and every aircraft delivered at that price widened the loss. The delivery schedule slipped. Costs escalated. The workforce swelled to meet targets the program couldn't hit, and every additional hire deepened the financial hole because the revenue those workers generated was less than the cost of employing them. It was the classic aerospace death spiral: price too low, costs too high, schedule too late, and the gap funded by a government that couldn't admit the scale of the problem without triggering the very crisis it was trying to avoid. Fred Kearns, the man who had championed both the water bomber and the Challenger, was at the center of the storm. The former Spitfire pilot who had watched Ross Richardson's prototype lift off the Cartierville runway in 1967 had made, in his own words, the biggest decision of his life when he ordered the Challenger into production. The water bomber had been a calculated risk that paid off. The Challenger was a calculated risk that didn't, not because the aircraft was bad, but because the business case was built on assumptions that reality dismantled one by one. The market was smaller than projected. The competition, Gulfstream, Dassault Falcon, was fiercer than expected. The manufacturing learning curve was steeper than the engineers had promised. And the funding mechanism that was supposed to bridge the gap between early losses and eventual profitability had become, through the letters of comfort, an invisible river of public money flowing into a program that couldn't generate enough revenue to justify its own existence. The fiscal year 1982 loss was reported at $1.4 billion. At the time, it was the largest single-year corporate loss in Canadian history. The number landed in Ottawa like an artillery shell. Maclean's reported on the 20th of June, 1983, that the committee wanted to know how Canadair managed to lose $1.4 billion in 1982, the largest corporate loss in Canadian history. Kearns himself testified before the Commons Finance Committee that spring. His words carried the weight of a man who understood that his career was finished and his legacy was being rewritten in real time. If I had written the script for ending my career of 37 years in the airplane business, I would not have written the current one. He resigned in 1983. He died in November 1987 at 63. Harry Halton, the engineer who had managed the Challenger from his wheelchair, who had driven the design team through the redesign that produced a genuinely excellent aircraft wrapped in a financially catastrophic business model, died in 2003. Neither man lived to see the Challenger line become, under Bombardier's management, one of the most successful business jet families in the world. The aircraft they built was good. The way they funded it nearly destroyed the company that built the water bomber. Chapter 8. The Parking Lot and the Shell Company. On the 24th of November, 1982, the Trudeau government moved to contain the damage. Canadair, along with de Havilland, Teleglobe, Eldorado Nuclear, and the government's Massey Ferguson equity stake, was transferred into a new entity, the Canada Development Investment Corporation, CDIC. The corporation was chaired by Maurice Strong, the Canadian diplomat and businessman who seemed to appear at the center of every major institutional restructuring of the era. Joel Bell, formerly economic advisor to Trudeau and executive vice president of Petro-Canada, was installed as CEO. In the House of Commons, Conservative leader Joe Clark called the appointments an entirely unacceptable set of circumstances in which Liberal Party patronage is the guiding rule, and dismissed Bell as a former Liberal henchman in Petro-Canada and in the Prime Minister's office. The language was typical Commons theater. The substance was not. CDIC was a holding company, a shell in practical terms, designed to receive approximately $1.2 billion of Canadair debt and park it off the company's operating books. The debt didn't disappear. It was transferred from a crown corporation that was supposed to generate revenue to a holding corporation that existed solely to hold the liability. The taxpayer still owned the loss. It was simply filed in a different cabinet. Total taxpayer exposure across the decade reached an estimated $2 to $2.2 billion. The combination of the Challenger program losses, the debt parked in CDIC, the accumulated Crown Corporation operating costs, and the inevitable write-downs. Maclean's, in its coverage of the privatization that followed, described the $2.2 billion Ottawa has spent on developing the company during the past 10 years. For context, that sum in 1982 dollars represented one of the largest single industry losses the Canadian government had ever absorbed. It was not a rounding error. It was not a write-off buried in a departmental budget. It was a figure large enough to dominate parliamentary debate, editorial pages, and the political calculations of both parties for years. And through all of it, through the Auditor General's investigation, through Kearns's testimony, through the CDIC transfer, through the editorials and the Commons questions and the slow-motion political crisis, the CL-215 line kept building aircraft. Plant 1 at Cartierville had two stories running simultaneously on the same factory floor. One was a scandal measured in billions. The other was a water bomber measured in 12-second scooping runs. The yellow aircraft leaving the building were profitable, technically uncontroversial, and, in the landscape of Crown Corporation catastrophe, politically untouchable. They were the good news story in a building that had very little good news left. As one Christian Science Monitor summary of Canadair's assets put it on the eve of the privatization, Canadair's main products are the Challenger, an executive jet, a water bomber for fighting forest fires, and surveillance drones. 2 out of 3 were problems. The water bomber was not. It was, in fact, part of what made the company worth buying. Chapter 9. Champagne on a Challenger. Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives won the 1984 federal election on the most sweeping parliamentary majority in Canadian history, 211 seats, and a platform that included, among its economic promises, the privatization of crown corporations that had become, in the conservative view, monuments to liberal mismanagement. Canadair was an early target. The water bomber was profitable. The Challenger line, though still bleeding, had an aircraft that the market wanted. The drone programs had contracts. Strip away the accumulated debt, which CDIC had already absorbed, and the company was a viable aerospace operation that a private buyer could turn around. The process nearly derailed before it began. Industry Minister Sinclair Stevens resigned in May 1986 over unrelated conflict of interest allegations, a finding that would later be overturned by the federal court in 2004, but which at the time consumed political oxygen and stalled the privatization file. The portfolio was reorganized. Barbara McDougall, appointed Minister of State for Privatization on the 30th of June, 1986, inherited the Canadair sale and drove it to conclusion with a speed that suggested someone in Ottawa understood the political cost of delay. The bidding attracted several parties. The Halifax-based IMP Group, led by Kenneth Chicken Rowe, one of the most persistent and colorful figures in Canadian aerospace, offered $225 million. Bombardier Inc., the Valcourt, Quebec manufacturer that had grown from Joseph Armand Bombardier's snowmobile patents into a diversified transportation company, offered less cash but a more complex deal. After what Maclean's described as a grueling 91.5-hour cabinet meeting, the kind of marathon session that suggests the decision was more politically fraught than the final announcement would imply, McDougall declared Bombardier the winner on the 13th of August, 1986. The terms, $120 million cash up front, a royalty arrangement on Challenger technology, a maximum of $170 million over 21 years, or a $20 million lump sum within 2 years. Ottawa eventually took the lump sum. A 1% royalty on any future CF-18 maintenance contract was offered as a sweetener. The $1.2 billion of debt parked in CDIC stayed where it was. The taxpayer absorbed the loss. Bombardier acquired the assets. After the announcement, Barbara McDougall and Bombardier chairman Laurent Baudouin flew together from Ottawa to Montreal aboard a Challenger jet. They toasted the deal with champagne. The aircraft they were sitting in, comfortable, pressurized, cruising smoothly above the St. Lawrence Valley, was the same model that had generated the billion-dollar loss that made the sale necessary. The irony was not subtle. It was, however, thoroughly Canadian. The quiet acknowledgement of a mess cleaned up, celebrated with understated corporate ceremony in the very machine that had caused the mess. Nobody wrote about the champagne toast at the time without noting the symbolism. Nobody who noted the symbolism could resist pointing out what the taxpayer had paid for the glass. The worker whose voice matters most in this transaction belonged to Norman Cherry. Cherry had been a Canadair employee since 1954 and president of IAM Local 712 since 1969. 20 years on the shop floor, 17 years running the union. A francophone activist in an anglophone-managed plant who understood the politics of Quebec aerospace with the fluency of someone who had lived every negotiation from the inside. In December 1985, when it became clear that Ottawa intended to sell, Cherry formed the Canadair Survival Committee, an organized campaign to keep the company publicly owned, to preserve the jobs, and to ensure that whatever happened next happened in Quebec. Once it became clear that the sale was inevitable, Cherry pivoted. He threw the union's weight behind the Bombardier bid rather than IMP's higher cash offer, a decision that was, on the surface, counterintuitive. IMP was offering more money, but Cherry understood something that the dollar figures didn't capture. Bombardier was headquartered in Quebec. Its chairman was a francophone Quebecois. Its workforce culture aligned with the Cartierville floor. And IMP, based in Halifax, represented a transfer out of the province, away from the ecosystem of suppliers, the transit links, the institutional relationships that kept a Cartierville workforce employed. Cherry backed Bombardier because keeping the plant in Quebec was worth more, in his calculation, than the difference in purchase price. David Chartrand, the current IA Malview Quebec coordinator, has said of Cherry's role. Normand played a key role in the sale of Canadair to Bombardier in 1986 by stepping up efforts to keep the Crown Corporation's jobs and operations in Quebec. Few people know this, but without his involvement, vision, and sense of negotiation, the face of aerospace in Quebec would probably not be the same. Cherry died on the 11th of April, 2021. He doesn't appear in most histories of the Canadair privatization. He should. The sale to Bombardier represented something rare in Canadian industrial history: the transfer of a major federally owned asset from Anglophone-led management to a Francophone-owned Quebec company. Laurent Baudouin, Joseph Armand Bombardier's son-in-law, had taken the family snowmobile firm public and built a rail transport empire on contracts that included New York subway cars and Channel Tunnel rolling stock. The Canadair acquisition was his leap into aerospace. He would later say, "Without the decision of the government to privatize Canadair, I don't think we would have gone into the aerospace sector." Within 5 years, Baudouin had also acquired Short Brothers of Belfast, Learjet of Wichita, and de Havilland Canada from Ottawa. The Canadair purchase wasn't a deal. It was a doorway. Baudouin walked through it and built one of the largest aerospace companies in the world on the other side. For the workers at Cartierville, the transition was, in the immediate term, relief. The job stayed. The plant stayed. The water bomber line, uninterrupted by the ownership change, continued building CL-215s and preparing the ground for what would come next: the turboprop upgrade that would turn a proven firefighter into a better one. Chapter 10. The turboprop, the lake, and the long goodbye. The upgrade had been in discussion since the mid-1980s. The CL-215's Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines were powerful and reliable, but they were piston engines, a technology whose maintenance costs and fuel consumption were increasingly uncompetitive against the turboprops that had become standard in utility aviation. In 1987, Canadair announced a retrofit program. 17 existing CL-215 airframes would receive Pratt & Whitney Canada PW123AF turboprops, creating the CL-215T variant. The marriage of the proven hull with modern engines produced an aircraft that was faster, more fuel-efficient, easier to maintain, and capable of carrying more water. 6,137 liters, up from the original 5,346. The definitive production version, the CL-415, first flew on the 6th of December, 1993, under Bombardier ownership. It entered service in November 1994. The turboprops delivered 1,775 kilowatts each. The cockpit was upgraded to an EFIS glass layout. Winglets and finlets improved aerodynamic efficiency. The water release system was refined. The CL-415 was not a new aircraft. It was the CL-215 made better in every measurable dimension, the way a second edition of a good book corrects the errors without changing the argument. The Quebec government believed in it enough to send a CL-415 on a 180-day, 21-country world sales tour, starting in 1995. The aircraft flew to potential customers across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, a flying demonstration that no brochure could match. When you're selling a water bomber, the only sales tool that matters is the water bomber. In 1998, Bombardier moved final assembly from Cartierville to its North Bay facility on Lake Nipissing, Ontario. The move made operational sense. North Bay sat on a lake, which meant flight testing could include water operations without ferrying the aircraft to a suitable body of water. It also meant that the last direct connection between the CL-415 and the Cartierville factory floor, where its predecessor had been conceived, was severed. The aircraft that had been born in Montreal would be finished in northern Ontario. Production continued for 17 years. 95 CL-415s were delivered to operators, including Canada, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, Croatia, and Turkey. By July 1996, 37 aircraft were already in service. The CL-415 fleet joined the CL-215 fleet in fire services across the Mediterranean and the Boreal North, and the yellow paint scheme, now on both variants, became the universally recognized symbol of aerial firefighting worldwide. But Bombardier's strategic center of gravity was shifting. Laurent Baudouin, had built an aerospace empire around the Canadair regional jet, a stretch challenger that sold over 1,900 units and transformed Bombardier into a major commercial aircraft manufacturer. The next step was the CE series, a clean-sheet narrow-body airliner intended to compete with the Airbus A220 and the smaller variants of Boeing's 737. The C-Series program would cost Bombardier approximately $10 billion Canadian and would eventually be sold to Airbus in a transaction that amounted to a corporate surrender. The water bomber line, profitable, steady, small, was not where Bombardier's attention or capital was directed. In October 2015, Bombardier closed the CL-415 production line at North Bay. 33 workers were laid off. The number tells you everything about what the program had become inside a company building regional jets and chasing a narrow-body dream. A footnote, valuable but minor, not worth the executive attention required to keep it running when every dollar and every engineering hour was being consumed by the CS series. David Curtis, who would later lead the program's resurrection, told the CBC, "This isn't meant as a critique of Bombardier, but we're a smaller company. We're able to be a little bit more nimble." The diplomatic phrasing was characteristic. What it described was a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate letting go of a program it no longer had the patience to operate. The type certificates, the legal ownership of the CL-215, CL-215T, and CL-415 designs, were sold to Viking Air of Victoria, British Columbia. The deal was announced on the 20th of June 2016 and closed on the 3rd of October. Viking, already the original equipment manufacturer for the Twin Otter and all out-of-production de Havilland aircraft, acquired responsibility for in-service support of a worldwide fleet of 170 aircraft in 11 countries. Terms were not disclosed. Curtis, Viking's president, framed the acquisition in language that resonated with anyone who had followed the water bomber's 6-decade journey. This acquisition ensures that a unique and important Canadian innovation stays in Canada. The aircraft that Ross Richardson had designed in the early 1960s, that Fred Kearns had championed, that Norman Cherry's Union had built, that Bombardier had inherited and eventually abandoned, was Canadian again. Not Crown-owned, not Bombardier-owned. Owned by a company in Victoria whose business model was keeping Canadian-designed aircraft alive long after their original manufacturers had moved on to other things. The water bomber had survived the Challenger scandal, survived nationalization and privatization, survived Bombardier's decade of strategic distraction, and landed in the hands of people who actually wanted it. Chapter 11. The Yellow Machines That Wouldn't Die. The resurrection moved quickly. Viking began work on a modernized variant, initially designated CL-515, later renamed DHC-515, under the revived de Havilland Canada brand that Longview Aviation Capital, Viking's parent, had acquired. Indonesia's Ministry of Defense signed as a launch customer in June 2019 for 6 aircraft. Bridger Aerospace of Bozeman, Montana, committed to 6 CL-415 EAF enhanced aerial firefighters in a contract valued at $204 million. The order book, dormant since 2015, was open again. On the 24th of March, 2024, in Montreal, the city where the CL-215 had first been designed 60 years earlier, Prime Ministers Justin Trudeau and Kyriakos Mitsotakis of Greece signed a confirmed order for 7 DHC-515 aircraft worth approximately 530 million Canadian dollars. Greece, which had lost 10 CL-215s in operational service, which had buried airmen who died flying the type over the fires of Evia and the Peloponnese, was buying the next generation. 2 of the 7 aircraft would be fully funded by the European Commission under the RescEU mechanism, the EU's reinforced firefighting capacity, built in direct response to the wildfire seasons that had grown longer, hotter, and more destructive with each passing year. Croatia signed for 2 the following day. France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain were expected to follow. On the 10th of March, 2026, de Havilland Canada announced through Globe Newswire that the cockpit and hull of the first DHC-515 had been joined on the company's Calgary Aerostructure assembly line to form the forward fuselage. The first 28.6-meter wing box was also complete. 22 aircraft were in production. Contracts had been signed with Manitoba, Ontario, and Alberta in addition to the European customers. First delivery was targeted for 2028. Calgary, not Montreal, not North Bay. Calgary, a city whose aerospace identity had been defined by military maintenance and oil patch helicopter operations, not by amphibious aircraft manufacturing. The Yellow Water Bomber, conceived in Cartierville, built for 60 years in Quebec and Ontario, was being reborn on a prairie assembly line 2,000 kilometers from the lake where CF-FEUX had first touched water in 1967. The geography of the resurrection was as improbable as the survival itself. The demand picture had changed in ways that the foresters who first approached Canadair in the early 1960s could never have imagined. Climate change had rewritten the mathematics of wildfire. European Commissioner for Crisis Management Janez Lenarčič announced EU funding for the DHC-515 fleet with language that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Firefighting capacity, ready to fight ever more intense wildfires in Europe. Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis, signing the order in Montreal, put it simply, the Mediterranean is a hot spot for climate change. David Curtis estimated total market potential at more than 100 aircraft. Other operators argued the real figure, if the global fleet was to be genuinely modernized, was closer to 150 to 200. A water bomber designed for Quebec's boreal fires had become an instrument of climate adaptation for the entire Mediterranean basin. In January 2025, Quebec 1 and Quebec 2 were on station in Los Angeles when the Palisades and Eaton fires tore through the Pacific Palisades and Altadena. The two Quebec CL-415s, flying under the 31-year-old agreement between Quebec and Los Angeles County, operated over a disaster that destroyed a combined 16,246 structures. On the 9th of January, one of the Quebec aircraft collided with a civilian drone over Los Angeles County airspace and was temporarily grounded for inspection at Santa Monica Airport. The drone was obliterated. The aircraft, built to survive repeated impacts with lake surfaces at 70 knots, was repaired and returned to service. It was a small detail in a catastrophic fire season, but it captured something essential about the type. Designed to take a beating, maintained by people who understood what the aircraft endured, operated in conditions that would ground anything less robust. The Fort McMurray fire of May 2016, described by the Quebec government as the worst natural disaster Canada has known in its history, had seen 4 Quebec CL-415s deploy from Jean Lesage Airport in Quebec City on the 5th of May, flying west under SOPVU coordination with the call sign Quo. They arrived in Alberta to fight a fire that had forced the evacuation of an entire city, that had burned across nearly 6,000 square kilometers, that had overwhelmed every land-based firefighting resource in the province. The Quebec water bombers didn't end the Fort McMurray fire. Nothing ended it except weather and time. But they were there, yellow, loud, scooping from Alberta lakes with the same motion and the same engineering that Ross Richardson had designed into the hull at Cartierville half a century earlier. The aircraft didn't care who owned the company that built it. It didn't care about letters of comfort or Auditor General reports or privatization debates or corporate strategy. It cared about water and fire and the 12 seconds between them. Cartierville Airport closed in 1988. The runways where CF-FEUX first flew became the Bois Franc neighborhood, a residential new urbanist development designed by architect Louis Sauer, inaugurated on the 6th of August 1993. Where Challenger serial number 1001 had lifted off in 1978, there are now houses, a community center, and a golf course. The golf course is called Le Challenger. Someone, again, had a sense of humor about what happened there. Plant 1, the original Canadian Vickers building, brick and steel, the factory that absorbed Canso production in 1944 and water bombers in 1967, still stands, still employs aerospace workers. Today, they build Bombardier Global and Challenger business jets, the descendants of the aircraft that nearly destroyed the company that built the water bomber. Greater Montreal houses 40% of the Canadian aerospace workforce and over 75% of the country's aerospace research and development. The ecosystem that grew up around Cartierville, Pratt and Whitney Canada in Longueuil, CAE in Saint-Laurent, Bell in Mirabel, Aero DevTech for landing gear, is the densest aerospace cluster in the country. The Canadair name is gone. The industrial culture it anchored is not. The CL-2 Femtime 415 fleet worldwide stands at roughly 164 aircraft in 11 countries. Quebec operates 14, Ontario 9, Newfoundland 7, Manitoba 11, Saskatchewan 6, France 12, Spain 14 and counting, Greece 19, and 7 more on order. Croatia, Turkey, Italy, Thailand. The yellow paint scheme visible on every continent where forests burn, and governments have decided that the fastest way to put water on fire is to scoop it from a lake at 70 knots and carry it in the belly of a machine designed in Montreal by an engineer who never got over the arrow. The Canadair water bomber was not the most technologically sophisticated aircraft ever built in Canada. It was not the fastest, or the most expensive, or the most politically celebrated. What it was, what it remains, is the most necessary. An aircraft designed to answer a simple question: how do you get water from a lake to a fire as fast as possible? The answer Ross Richardson gave in the early 1960s has not been improved upon. The hull is the same shape. The scooping principle is the same. The 12 seconds are the same. Everything else, the company, the Crown Corporation, the ownership, the politics, the billion-dollar scandal, the privatization, the Bombardier era, the Viking resurrection, everything else changed around it, repeatedly and sometimes violently. The aircraft endured. The forests are still burning. The yellow machines are still flying. And in Calgary, on a prairie assembly line that didn't exist when the first CL-215 was nothing more than a pencil sketch on Ross Richardson's drafting table, the cockpit and hull of the first DHC-515 have been joined. It is the same aircraft in essence, the same flat bottom, the same scooping probes, the same 12 seconds on the lake, built by different hands, in a different city, for a world that needs it more than the one it was born into. The Foresters got what they asked for. The aircraft outlived everything else.